Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll get to business first thing this morning on a Monday morning after having a weekend break. I'll try to recapture where we are briefly before we begin, and we'll be beginning on the second full paragraph on page 142 for those who are following along. There arose a great controversy between the civil powers of the area known as Piedmont in northwest Italy and southeastern France, the original area once occupied by the God-fearing, Bible-believing Waldenses who had been extirpated and annihilated out of the land. Now the area is completely Roman Catholic, and so are the governments, the civil governments of the area. And the civil governments of the area were attempting to bring the priests under the jurisdiction of the civil power. They were committing crimes, and their churches were used as asylums for criminals, and the civil authorities were tired of the criminality of the priests and wanted to make them subject to civil courts. They wanted jurisdiction over the priests to put down the criminality of the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the country. And of course, the Pope stating that his priests are his, and that his church constitutes a complete society, and that nowhere on the earth may the Pope's disciplinary authority be overthrown. In other words, his authority to exercise discipline over his own priests could not be deprived by the civil governments, that the government of the Pope is superior to any civil government. And so there came a push-come-to-shove moment between the civil governments and the papacy in the area of Piedmont. Now, on this great question, the Pope said through his Cardinal Antonelli, the Prime Minister of the Pope, he says he briefly alludes to the concordats solemnly concluded in Piedmont. In other words, Piedmont had signed a concordat with the Vatican, and then proposes the question whether a state, particularly a Catholic one, may, on changing its political organization, disregard the disciplinary rights of the Church without the consent of the Holy See. In other words, the Concordat guarantees that you can't, the Concordat which they signed could not allow the civil government to usurp the disciplinary rights of the Pope, at least not without his permission. If the civil government of Piedmont wished to bring the priests to justice and to prevent the Roman Catholic churches from being a refuge for criminals under the protection of the priests, then they had to get the Pope's permission, because the Concordat forbid them from doing such thing. Now, obviously, the Church sees itself completely independent. The papacy considers itself completely independent and of a superior order to the civil governments of the world. And that's no less true today as it was then. This is how Rome sees every government. And it will not permit civil governments, particularly those with whom have concordats signed with the Vatican, will never allow the civil government to try and convict and imprison or in any way discipline her subjects, the priests and even individual Roman Catholics. They are to be submitted to the Roman Catholic tribunals. That's the Pope's jurisdiction. Okay, I hope my listeners are contemplating the eventualities that come from this philosophy. If the Pope is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and his jurisdiction cannot be limited, nor his power and authority to discipline, he literally usurps all the governments of the world. Okay? He's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and civil governments are there for no other purpose than to just serve the Pope. And that's exactly what Roman Catholic canon law stipulates. Now, he says, now here no claim is advanced to an immediate or direct jurisdiction over temporal affairs and temporal rulers. In other words, it doesn't claim outrightly. That would raise alarms, wouldn't it? No official claim and no overt claim over temporal affairs and temporal rulers is asserted in this language, but practically the jurisdiction asserted is tantamount to this. Okay, in a roundabout way, the papacy literally says that it has direct and immediate jurisdiction over all temporal affairs and temporal rulers. In other words, the civil government is just a servant of the Pope. And if it's not the servant of the Pope, it's not a legitimate government. Okay, it's just the civil power is to position itself to be just an extension of the papal arm. That's the only legitimate role for civil government. He says, now, here, no claim is advanced to an immediate and direct jurisdiction over temporal affairs and temporal rulers, but practically, the jurisdiction asserted here is tantamount to this. He says 3 positions are laid down. For those who may have gotten lost, we've now begun the second paragraph on page 142. He says 3 positions are laid down. First, that the authority of the Church of Rome, quote, has no territorial limits, unquote. In other words, this also means first that the authority of the Pope has no territorial limits. No territorial limits, and I talked about last weekend, the Pope's territorial limits are in fact limitless, and it claims jurisdiction over heaven, over the earth, and over purgatory. Nobody gets into heaven without the Pope's sanction. Nobody lives, moves, or has its being on the earth without the Pope's without the Pope's influence and control, and no one escapes purgatory or hell in this case without the Pope's relief. So the Pope has no jurisdictional territorial limits. It's limitless. He literally puts himself in the same position as God. This is what makes the papacy the Antichrist of the Bible. The man of sin, the son of perdition, the mouth that blasphemes, the eyes with the eyes like a man, okay, that oversees the whole creation and puts himself on the throne of this, that is God's creation. This is a usurpation of God's rightful throne. All right. First, that the authority of the Church of Rome, or rather the Pope, has no territorial limits. That is, that her jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of the Pope, extends over all Christendom and beyond it. Okay, those are just milder words than saying that the papacy has no territorial limits. Okay? At least it controls all of Christendom and beyond it. How far beyond it? All the way to the throne of God and all the way to the pit. And everything in between. Now, before I even continue, I'll ask you, is there any territorial limits to the Pope's jurisdiction and control and discipline within the halls of Congress in the United States of America? No. No. Is there any territorial or jurisdictional limitation to the Pope's access to the White House? No. How about to the inner sanctum of the Supreme Court? Is there any jurisdictional limitation upon the Pope at the Supreme Court? No. Okay. How about party politics? Either left or right. Take your pick. Is there any territorial jurisdictional limitation to the Pope's control in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? No. Okay? There is no place on this earth that is exempt from papal control. Okay? I hope this is sinking in. This is difficult for people. He says, first, the authority of the Church of Rome has no territorial limits. That is, her jurisdiction extends over all Christendom and beyond it. Okay, that's an understatement. Okay. Second, quote, she is everywhere the sole arbiter of her discipline, unquote, which means that she claims the right of saying what causes affect the interests of religion, that is, the Church of Rome, because Rome is the only true church in Roman Catholic canon law. So anything that can be construed as having any effect, whether direct or indirect, upon the subject of religion affects the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope's jurisdiction, and therefore it comes under the Pope's lawful jurisdiction. And of course, anything in the temporal world or the spiritual world can extraneously be said to affect the cause of religion in the world. So there is nothing outside the Pope's jurisdiction, which is just a reiteration of what we established before, that the Pope's jurisdiction has no territorial limits. It is just as much the territory and jurisdiction of the authority of the Pope in temporal things as it is in spiritual things. He says, there is no matter which may not be made to appear to have a bearing more or less direct upon the interests of the Church, and therefore there is no matter over which the Church may not claim jurisdiction. Okay? These are just lots of words to describe a very simple concept. The Pope is, in effect, God on earth. And what jurisdiction is there that is not under the Creator's purview? None. And that's the exact same position that the papacy asserts for itself. And if there's anything in the world that could convince a person who is not inclined to believe this information that the papacy is the Antichrist of the Bible, that it speaks of none other but the papacy, this should do it. This should be enough information for you to comprehend that funky little man in Rome who traipses around the world to throngs of people that worship him could be the man of sin spoken of in the Bible. This is it. That he claims no jurisdictional limits. Nowhere in the world, nowhere in heaven, and nowhere in hell is the Pope's jurisdiction limited. He is, as it were, God on earth. Just like it says in Roman Catholic canon law, when the Pope speaks, it is God who speaks. When the Pope speaks, it is as if God has spoken. I don't know how much clearer I can make it. And if you can find anything else in this world, in the past or in the present or in the future, that better fulfills the biblical prophetic role of the man of sin, the little horn, the Antichrist, then I wish you would write me and inform me so I can correct my error. But I don't see how there could be a better, more perfect self-incrimination of, of the Antichrist as what we're reading right here. Okay? This should settle the issue once and for all of my listeners, who the Antichrist of the Bible is. Yes, there have been many wicked people, and there'll be many more wicked people in the future, what little future there is left in this world. None of them will claim for himself what the papacy has claimed for all of its existence. We're just not made aware of the blasphemous claims that the papacy has made throughout its history. And this is what Inquisition Update, one of the main purposes of Inquisition Update is to inform the listeners what is the papacy. In other words, we're trying to identify a counterfeit. The example is often used. How would you be able to identify a counterfeit dollar bill or Federal Reserve note, if you prefer, if you had never seen an original one? Or how could you identify the original and be sure it's an original unless you'd seen one counterfeited? Okay, it kind of goes hand in hand. Now, our Bible tells us who Christ is. It identifies him so much and so clearly that we can look at the scriptures and know who the true Christ was. But the world describes for us this counterfeit. And all we have to do is compare it with the original in the Bible, and we're convinced beyond a doubt which is true and which is the counterfeit. And there's nothing that more closely tries to paint itself a perfect image of Christ than the papacy, and yet be so identifiably counterfeit. The papacy tries to make itself King of Kings and Lord of Lords and the arbiter of all justice in the world. And it's the counterfeit. The papacy has made no matter among men not the direct jurisdiction of the Pope. There's no matter of spiritual things, no matter of temporal things, which is all matter together, can be limited from the Pope's jurisdiction. It's universal power. That's why they call it universal power. It's Catholic power. It's the counterfeit. Now, the Pope says, being King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that he may excommunicate any minister or prince. All right, any minister or prince represents the civil power, a minister of the government or the prince over the government. She may abrogate laws, that is, to do away with laws or forbid their enactment, as we have seen her do in Piedmont, on the ground of which she is the sole judge that these laws interfere with the interests of religion. Okay? What laws are we talking about? The law that was passed in Piedmont that allowed the civil government to cross the threshold of a sanctified Roman Catholic Church and enter there and take the priest into custody and to subject him to the authority of the civil government and bring him to justice, charge him with a crime, try him under their system, and imprison him. Exercise discipline upon that priest. This was a violation of Roman Catholic canon law, and the Pope said it was illegal. He abrogated that law. It's no law at all. My Pope, excuse me, according to the papacy, his priests are as sacrosanct as he is. Sacrosanct as he is. They are emanations of the Pope, all of his priests. And all of his churches are immune from the civil authority. Okay, I've repeated myself till I'm boring myself, but it's got to sink in at some point. She may excommunicate any minister or prince. She may abrogate laws and forbid their enactment, as we've seen her do in Piedmont, on the ground of which she is the sole judge that these laws interfere with the interests of religion. This is merely the temporal supremacy in another shape, says the author. Okay. He says the third position is more subtle and not less dangerous than the preceding two, namely that the church is a divine institution, a true and perfect society of a superior order to that of the civil societies. Just another way of saying the same thing. He says, in a sense, this is true, but the design of asserting it here is not to vindicate the independence of the church per se, but to annihilate the independence of the state. Okay, so the cardinal is telling the state, you have no independence to break your concordat with the papacy and to overthrow his disciplinary rights and to invade his churches and take his priests prisoner and subject them to any other authority on the earth but the papacy's. You may not change your governmental affairs, you may not change any form of your government without the approval of the Pope. And that you've now claimed jurisdiction over the priests, you have changed your government. And you have done it without the Pope's permission. So, now stop and think what effect Roman Catholic canon law has upon our government. And if you suppose in your mind that anything has changed since this account that we're reading that occurred in the 1800s in Piedmont, if you are suggesting that the situation has changed, that the papacy has changed its opinion over the civil governments of the world, then I wish you'd show me proof. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. If you have evidentiary evidence that Roman Catholic canon law has been changed and that the Pope now considers the civil government a challenge to his authority, and on some occurrences the papacy may approve any encroachment of the civil government upon his universal, unlimited authority, I wish you could prove it. Canon law, send it to me. If you're a Roman Catholic who is listening and says that the Roman Catholic Church has changed, then you have an opportunity to prove it. And I will read your evidence right here on Inquisition Update. If you say the papacy does not assert the same authority in the United States government as he did during the time of this conflict in Piedmont, show me. And I will present that evidence to all of my listeners here at Inquisition Update. That ought to be a challenge to my Roman Catholic critic, who loves to assail me for failing to dot an I or cross an occasional T, who would like to prove that Inquisition Update is a false accusation against the Roman Catholic Church. He now has an opportunity to redeem himself and possibly to even access airtime here on First Amendment Radio to explain how I have so grievously erred against the Roman Catholic Church. Here's your opportunity. We'll be back right after the message. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors it. If you'd like to contact me by email, please do so. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. Now, this statement of the Cardinal simply overthrew any so-called independence of the state. The state has no independence. The papacy insists on being ruler of kings and governments. They are to serve him, or they are no government at all. Now, he says further, It is not the doctrine of independent coordinate jurisdiction which is here affirmed, but the dogma of uncontrolled, unlimited spiritual jurisdiction. Okay? The limitation of the civil power is the purpose of limiting the civil power's jurisdiction, or the annihilation, rather, or the independence of the state, is to make more perfect Rome's spiritual jurisdiction. That's the ultimate aim of all of it. That the papacy controls the governments of the world and coerces them to do his bidding is to assure the Pope's spiritual jurisdiction in every country. That's the end game. Who we're going to worship. That's what it's all about with Satan's vicar in Rome. Who we're going to worship. It's all about worship. Now, if a nation of heretics, Protestants, as in the United States of America, if they will not willingly bow down and worship the Pope, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were required to do so many thousand years ago, the Pope can then punish them. It's all about worship. If you try to say it's about anything but worship, you've made an error. Okay, many assert that it is to get us all to use his economic system. I disagree respectfully with those. The uniformity that we're now seeing taking shape in the world of a global economic system is just a global means to a spiritual end. It's all going to boil down to this: who will you worship? We know this is the end game because it was always about worship in the Old Testament in Israel. It was always about who they worshiped. And it's not going to change. Satan insisted that even Jesus should bow down and worship him. It's all about worship. And so the so-called chip and the universal monetary system and all is just a means to a spiritual end. To whom are we going to bow down and worship? Now, the governments of the world are demanded by the Pope to cause the people to bow down and worship him. It's all about worship. It's about the dogma of uncontrolled, unlimited spiritual jurisdiction of the Pope. So says James A. Wiley, a very trusted Protestant professor and historian. And everything we've read here at Inquisition Update confirms the papacy's greatest desire is that every man, woman, and child on the planet bow down and worship him. Just as did Satan when he tempted our Christ after his baptism. All right, so I've made the point. I can be challenged, but I'm very firm in my conviction on this. Now, he says, everyone who is familiar with the history of the supremacy, that is, the papal supremacy, knows that on this very plea, Rome raised herself to the dominion over states and princes in former times. Okay? It was all about worship. Who are you going to obey? And Rome foisted the idea amongst the kings of Europe that the Pope's jurisdiction was unlimited and complete, and that the civil government had absolutely no power whatsoever unless it was invested in it by the papacy, that the civil governments of the world did not exist unless they existed under the blessing of the Pope, and that they did his bidding. This is how the papacy got control over princes and states. This is how the old world order existed. If any king thought himself greater than the Pope and began to break down Roman Catholic canon law and do like this king in Piedmont tried to do, and usurp the Pope's authority over his priests, and to violate the sanctity of the churches in rounding up those priests and subjecting them to civil jurisdiction, they came under swift correction and fatal correction from the Pope. The Pope expected to be worshipped and obeyed. And to the degree that he was worshipped and obeyed, the princes and the kings of Europe had peace. And to the degree that they rebelled against this pretended authority of the papacy, they had war and famine and persecution. And they had their crowns lifted, and sometimes with their heads attached. That's the old world order. There's not a difference whatsoever between the old world order and the new world order. There's only one difference, a time element. But there was a gap. Okay? If there's any legitimate discussion of a gap in Bible prophecy, it happened during the Protestant Reformation, when the Pope was stripped of both his temporal and his spiritual authority. So the papacy, brick by brick, is rebuilding the old Roman Empire, the old Holy Roman Empire. And he's doing it with the help of the governments of the world, and nowhere less so nowhere more so than in the United States of America. Doing it right under the noses of American Protestants. And you won't hear but a handful of Protestants in this country raising the alarm about it. Okay, he says again, everyone who is familiar with the history of the papal supremacy knows that on this very plea, Rome raised herself to the dominion over states and princes in former times. This idea that the Pope is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords extended her temporal jurisdiction over the heads of the kings of the earth. He says, in her struggles, first with the Frankish kings and next with the Germanic emperors, the Church of Rome talked of the superiority of the ecclesiastical, that is, the superiority of the church over the civil, and thus gradually but steadily advanced her pretensions from a claim of respect to a claim of obedience, from a power to counsel to a power to govern. Okay? Slowly but surely, the Pope gained the ascendancy over the kings of the earth. At first, she just merely made the claims, but then she demanded obedience. First, she counseled the kings of the earth, and then she insisted upon governing over them. That's how the old world order was built. And that's how it's being rebuilt. He says, let this fact then be borne in mind. For a fact it is, that the Church of Rome is advancing claims in Piedmont which carry as full and supreme a measure of jurisdiction over temporal affairs, that is, over princes and states, as ever were advanced by Hildebrand in the 11th century. Now, who's this reference to Hildebrand? This is Pope Gregory VII, who more than any pope in the history of the Roman Catholic Church asserted his undeniable, unchallengeable, limitless authority over all civil governments. Hildebrand put flesh and bones to the claim that the papacy is God on earth. Okay? Hildebrand, more than anyone, Gregory VII demonstrated the beast that he was. He cared nothing for anything in this world but his temporal and spiritual jurisdiction. He extended the jurisdiction of the papacy to every square corner of the earth and insisted that the kings and princes of the world be his subjects, and they do according to his will. Now, maybe sometime prior to that, someone may suggest that, well, it's just an assumption that the kings of the earth should serve the papacy, but Hildebrand put it as a matter of Roman Catholic canon law. And it's been the law of the church ever since. Okay, popes and kings alike recognize the power of Gregory the Seventh, Hildebrand, as they call him, of the 11th century. It is Hildebrand that should get credit for for building the old world order. And the new world order is just simply the reestablishment of the old. He says, and let this other deliverance of the pontifical court be borne in mind, that no state can change its political organization without the consent of the Holy See. Okay? What does that mean? No state. First it says no state. Does anybody see any exception in there for the United States or England or any place else? No. It says no state can change its political organization. What's our political organization? Can we change it? Has it been changed? Without the consent of the Holy See. So who wrote the 13th and 14th Amendments that enslaved us all? Was it our independent civil government? Or did they have permission to change their form of government, their political organization, with the 13th and 14th Amendment? And from whom did they get that permission? From the Holy See, from the Roman Pontiff, from the Antichrist of the Bible. You see, there are many people in the truth movement who will tell you how you were enslaved by the 13th and 14th Amendments. But no one will tell you who ultimately got the credit for enslaving you all through the 13th and 14th Amendment. Roman Catholic canon law stipulates that no state can change its political organization without the consent of the Roman See. Think about it a minute. It's all very well and good that we are learning how the 13th and the 14th Amendments made us subjects of a new government. But by what authority did they have to usurp the original government of the country? What authority did they first have to change their political organization? They got it from the Roman See. That's according to Roman Catholic canon law. He says this doctrine would stereotype Europe. In other words, what he's telling us is that this doctrine of no state can change its political organization without the consent of the Holy See means the Holy See will control all the governments of the states. And if the Pope controls all the governments of all the states, then won't they be adherents to Roman Catholic canon law? He says this doctrine would stereotype Europe. In other words, make every nation the same. Stereotype means copies of one another. Every state in Europe would be a copy of the other. They would all be the same. And they would all take on the image of Rome. In other words, the old world order would be physically reestablished. They would have the same uniformity and look and appearance as they did in the old world order. They would be stereotyped. Each the image of the other. And of course, the mother determines what they look like. Rome. Now we have a European Union, don't we? And who's the arbiter of that change of government? The papacy. It's being made the very image of their whorish, Romish mother. They're adopting the same form of government. It's a papal government. It's fashioned of, by, and for the Pope. And it makes every subject a subject of the Roman pontiff. Just as does the civil law in this country make us all, whether we know it or not, whether we're willing to admit it or not, whether we're even willing to contemplate the possibility or not, we are all made by our civil government subjects of the Roman pontiff. This doctrine, says James A. Wiley, would stereotype Europe. But it would also stereotype all the nations of the world where the Pope has jurisdiction. And we've already learned that there is no limit to his jurisdiction. So now the United States is going to look like Europe. And we're all going to look like our Holy Roman Mother. A papal monarchy. He says not one of its states dare introduce a single reform or take one step in the path of political or social amelioration, lest thereby the interests of the Church of Rome should suffer. No civil government may change its political system and affect any realm, either the political or the social order, that negatively affects the Church of Rome or limits her jurisdiction, and in any way should cause the Roman Catholic Church or the papacy to suffer. Now, can you vision what the New World Order is? You see, all states in the Old World Order were overthrown because of the Protestant Reformation. The recognition and the acknowledgement that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of the Bible, the tyrant of the Bible, the one who causes the whole world to sin against God. Canon law was his law. It was to replace God's holy, eternal, and immutable law. It was to exalt the Pope's throne above the stars of God. To exalt the Pope's throne above that of God's himself. The Protestant Reformation ruined all of that for the Pope. It was the only serious challenge that the papacy ever received in its history. And if the New World Order is ever going to be rebuilt, if the Old World Order is ever going to be rebuilt in the image and the name of the New World Order, then Protestantism must be destroyed. And so if there was a government in the world like the United States that was established under Protestant principles, that did not regard Roman Catholic canon law, that only tolerated Roman Catholics and Roman Catholicism, then it must be overthrown. And it must do so under the authority of the papacy and with his permission and approval. And that was the 13th and 14th Amendments. And the establishment of Washington, D.C. as a corporation, identical to the corporation in Rome. Our government was overthrown. The people were never told. The Pope gained control of our government. Vatican Council II just put the icing on the cake and got the ignorant, deceived Protestants to capitulate on their Protestantism, to admit that now that since they believe in a future Antichrist, one that can't be the Pope anymore, can't be the history of the popes, can't be every pope in succession from the very first pope to the very last pope, but it's just one single individual that hasn't even come upon the world scene yet. They just laid down and died and lent their carcasses to the King of Rome. They just added their dead voices to the dead voices that rule and reign in Washington, D.C. They'll never see life. And now they're stereotyping us. They're conforming the government of this country to be consistent with Roman Catholic canon law, just like the European Union and just like the whole world. And if anybody speaks out about it, he's a religious bigot, right? He's a hateful person. He raises his voice too much. He seems angry. Why, Christians shouldn't be angry. They should be holy, gracious, speak smooth things, buttery things, assure the people, give them confidence. I'm sorry. I wouldn't be helping you at all if I did such a thing. He says, not one of its states dare introduce a single reform or take one step in the path of political or social amelioration, lest thereby the interests of the Church of Rome should suffer. Let me ask you a question. If you're comprehending what James A. Wiley's telling you, do you think now that there might be real, as appears at least on the surface, that there might be any real difference between the Democratic and Republican parties in this country? Do you think that there's either one, the Democratic or the Republican parties, ever going to stand up and challenge the Pope's authority? Was it not Democrats and Republicans that were sitting at a joint session of Congress when Pope Francis I spoke before them and made them all weep? No, they're all on his side. They know they occupy their chairs of authority, their vast wealth, their perfect retirement benefits, all the cushy things that they enjoy, all the press coverage, all the pomp and circumstance, all the authority, because of that Pope. You think either one of them, Democratic or Republican, is going to challenge the one who gives them their power? Is there one in Washington, D.C. colored either a Democratic or a Republican politician in Washington going to bite the hand that feeds him? No. It's a government of men, and it's ruled by one single man. Democrat and Republican alike. You won't see any of those stand before a microphone and before cameras of the world and say the Pope is the Antichrist and he has gained illegal control over our government. He has usurped the lawful constitutional government of this country and now proclaims himself to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in the United States. And we, against our understanding, have been passing his Roman Catholic canon laws and have been enforcing those Roman Catholic canon laws upon the citizenry of this country all of our lives, and we repent. No politician, either Democratic or Republican, is going to stand before a microphone in front of cameras and say all the wars that we've fought since the Revolutionary War have been to establish the papal authority in this country. The current war on terror is no less a crusade than were the crusades against the Turks and against Jerusalem of yesteryear. No congressman, Democratic or Republican, is going to stand in front of a microphone and a camera and tell you we at Vatican Council II repented of our Protestantism and threw all of our power and strength and authority upon the Roman Catholics in our government, upon the priests and the cardinals and the bishops of this country. Nobody's ever going to tell you that in front of a camera, in front of a microphone. But I will. If you'll support me, I will. And if you wish to support me, please support First Amendment Radio. And with your blessing, I'll return tomorrow. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. We'll continue our reading of Rome and Civil Liberty by the Protestant historian James A. Wiley, who is opening our eyes today.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.